I'm going to start recording. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the NR493/Geospatial Centroid crossover seminar. Today we have postdoc Dr. Mark Ditmer from the Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology Department. And he's going to be talking about wolves in Colorado, about habitat suitability modeling and conflict risk modeling. It's a really fascinating topic, and I think that's why so many people are logged in. So Mark, I will hand it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to speak tonight. Yeah, I should just put in one caveat is I am a postdoc at Colorado State, but I still live in Minnesota. I started this position at the beginning of the pandemic and never really got to make the move down there. But anyway, so if I'm unfamiliar with certain, areas that I'm actually talking about today, you'll have to excuse me as I'm still learning the geography of Colorado as I put together these models. But yeah, so I will begin sharing my screen. I'll give you a little bit more background as I do. All right. All right. All right, there we go. So yeah, title is Wolves in Colorado, Habitat Suitability and Conflict Risk Modeling. And this is work with Doctors Ditmer and Crooks. And so many of you are probably very familiar, as you probably had all sorts of news inundating your local Twitter or Facebook and local news about the vote in Colorado to restore wolves to the western slope. Now, and so maybe you're sort of immune to, at this point, how unique this really is it's never really been an approach done before for restoration of a large carnivore. And a lot of the work through CSU has been done from the Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence that Dr. Crooks leads. And they've been doing seminars and putting out information sheets to put out the best science for what we know and what we might be able to expect, if wolves were to, if the ballot initiative were to pass. And of course it did. But the issue is that there's a lot of voters in the Front Range, but there's where the wolves will be placed is much more sparsely populated, but has a lot more potential for conflict. And here's a Denver Post article about how Western ranchers are wary and worried about all this. And there was also, of course, a lot of money put into expressing their fears as well. So as you probably are well aware, as this shaped up, it passed by a razor hair margin, less than 2% of the vote. And so, sort of potentially validating some of these fears that it's sort of a really split issue between urban voters versus more rural. So we have to be able to account for that in some capacity. And I believe the article that I passed along, if you read it, was thinking about this idea of anthropogenic resistance, where it's not just about the ecology and how the environment and habitats for species are connected, but going a bit beyond that and actually considering how the landscape is being used and therefore also the attitudes of people living in those places. And these ideas of going beyond just structural connectivity of habitat are really sort of taking off. And actually in some of my other research that I've been wrapping up from a different postdoc, it's been thinking about the sensory environment. So artificial light, noise, these things that can alter the environment, but they're harder to measure and harder to quantify. So thinking about how those actual sensory experiences of an animal moving through their environment can further influence what is good habitat, what is connected habitat from one place to the other. But in this paper, it's thinking about these more human dimensions and how people actually are using the land and their attitudes towards the species of interest that can actually influence their ability to go from place to place. And this is an important idea for, especially for Colorado, because you may know that there's been wolves that have shown up into the far northwest corner of the state multiple times now, but often they're either shot or they go back into Wyoming where they're then shot. So there's this issue of human resistance, anthropogenic resistance of allowing wolves to return naturally, which is really what sort of kickstarted this initiative, is to do this via vote, to actually restore wolves to places in Colorado where they can thrive and not have to deal with this anthropogenic resistance. Because as I'll show you today, Colorado has a lot of great habitat for wolves, a large prey base, but in the natural way that they would come down from, say, a big source population such as Yellowstone, they encounter a ton of this anthropogenic resistance in the form of, well, Wyoming's pretty, outside of the national park, is pretty hostile towards wolves, and that northwest corner of Colorado has a lot of farming and ranching, sheep production, and that's not always conducive to coexistence with wolves as well. And I'll show you today how I've attempted to incorporate those factors in our understanding of sort of the best potential restoration areas for wolves within the state. And so all of what I'll talk about today, we had to base the modeling attempts off of the literature out there, because we don't really have GPS collared wolves in Colorado. I think they just collared one that's sort of on the edge of the border of the state. But normally, we might establish these relationships for a species and their habitat and connectivity and movement based on empirical data collected from GPS collared animals. And that's typically what I've done in the past. My PhD was looking at the movement of American black bears in an agricultural region as they moved from little patch of habit forest to another patch, crossing over big areas of crop and crossing roads and things like that. And I've done that for several different species. So this has been sort of a new experience for me, in that I'm working with theoretical wolves, whereby we're developing these models based off of what is best known in the literature for where they'll be able to thrive and avoid that human conflict component that we want to avoid for when they're restored. So all of the modeling assumptions today are going to be based off of the literature, and we tried to utilize literature from similar locations of wolves. Obviously, they're located throughout the globe in a lot of northern climates, especially. But we tended to shy away from the Scandinavian countries and rely more on the northern Rockies to develop our understanding and to create our models. That using the data and information that we could glean about wolf behavior and habitat use in those places to apply it to Colorado. And so in the first side of our model, we can think about the ecological side only. So habitat suitability. And really, it's pretty well known that wolves are able to essentially thrive in most habitats if there's a good enough prey base and they're not persecuted to the point of it negatively impacting their population from people. So the first step here is to understanding where are the wolves going to be able to find enough prey, and how does that influence and how does that change seasonally, since you have such a varied topography as the prey base shifts from different elevational gradients from different points in the year. So to develop spatially explicit estimates of prey availability, we relied on a lot of publicly available data. We just made them spatial. So what you see here are estimates of, we transformed estimates of elk and deer populations from the Colorado Parks and Wildlife within their data analysis units. So this is sort of how they track herds, populations of herds throughout the state. And so they report their best estimates of the populations at the herd level for year after year. And so we were able to find the spatial delineations of these herd areas, apply that population estimates, and divide by the area to get at these density values. And there you can see elk, and this is deer. This is both whitetail and mule deer. And I'll talk a little bit about this going forward, but we also did several different sensitivity analyses to understand how robust our models are to potential, to other assumptions. Because again, these are basically theoretical wolves at this point. So we also looked at prey density when we consider all different potential ungulate species throughout the state. And so this is not only elk and deer, but this has bighorn sheep, both Rocky Mountain and desert. We have pronghorn and we have moose, all rolled into one here. And this is our 2019 estimates of a prey base. But for now, we're going to actually just use this elk and deer because those are the primary species that wolves zero in on. So this forms the foundation for the prey density map that's going to kind of drive a lot of what we know going forward. So we have now, so for example, for elk, we have our CPW data and we apply them to these units. So now we have a density of the elk population. We can then look at, CPW also has range delineations, and this is actually a pretty ugly map, I apologize, but we have here pink is their overall winter range, red is concentration areas, and yellow is where their resident population areas. And they have these delineations for these different sort of intensities of use that are broadly applied for different seasons and for all those different species that I mentioned. And so when we apply, just do a basic filtering of our population density and apply it to these different range delineations where our concentration areas we're assuming are 2x density, while the regular range is, I forget the number we applied, but it might have been like 50% density, so that we can kind of account for where we expect to actually see more of these different species at different times of year. So it allows us to get at more of the seasonality of the shifting distributions of the prey. And then this is what it then looks like when we apply those filters and those additional density multiply basically our values out. So here's where elk density looks like for 2019. And we do that again for deer, and for the other species, we did it as well for a different scenario. And this is what it looks like for winter when we think about all those different prey species. And this also kind of shows you why we just are using elk and deer as our main model, because this is all put on the same scale. And what you'll notice is that aside from a little bit from pronghorn, these other species are relatively very few compared to elk and deer. They're going to be the most abundant species available for wolves to eat throughout the state. And the same thing for summer. But now what you see is a lot more of the map filled in as these species are able to spread out. They're not just concentrated in those lower elevation areas where they're seeking out forage. Now they can move up into the mountains, up into higher elevations, and kind of spread out more. So we see a lot more of this prey density throughout the state when we think of the summer prey density. So then what does this look like when we think about it in terms of how a wolf pack might see the landscape? And so all I did was I developed estimates of what is the sort of average home range size that a pack of wolves has around the Yellowstone region. And we applied it as a smoothing filter across the states, whereby what you can think about this as just simply for every single pixel, every single point on the map, if you were to average how much prey is available around you for an average wolf pack size, it would kind of give you an estimate of the prey density at every single point on the map and sort of smoothing things out. Because the idea is we were applying those hard and fast filters that I showed you before of multiplying those seasonal ranges times those population density numbers. But really, we all know those aren't necessarily hard and fast areas. It's not like CPW goes and builds a fence and says, all the elk have to stay in here. They're obviously moving in and out of it. Wolves can move in and out of those areas. So this smoother allows us a little bit more of a fudge factor to kind of understand it at a broader spatial scale as a wolf pack might move throughout the landscape. So it doesn't have those we're not just restricted to exactly where we think those prey might be. It allows a bit of this area would potentially sustain a pack depending on, this is how much prey would be available at any one point on our map. And then this is what it looks like for summer. Again, this is as the prey spreads out, and we have a different scale here on the bottom. On the winter, we see that highly concentrated areas of up to 18 individuals prey in a given spot. Whereas in summer, we have a lot more of the high values, but now a high value is 10 individuals in our density estimate. So that forms the basis of just simply where are there prey, but then we can refine this further by thinking about how wolves and their prey move and utilize the landscape, and also how wolves are able to actually access and successfully hunt and kill these prey. So for example, wolves are known to tend to avoid areas with high road density if they're high use roads. We can also think about factors that influence where prey are going to be moving to find forage within those ranges that we already defined as this is where they're located in the winter and summer. And then finally, we can think about wolves' ecology again. They're a stalk and chase predator where they're going to need more flatter areas to be able to chase down prey. They're not like a cougar hiding behind a big boulder that jumps out and kills prey. They want to be able to chase down prey over large areas that are generally flat. So really steep slopes and things like that aren't going to be conducive for successful hunting. So to incorporate these things, for the winter, we're incorporating slope throughout the state. This is normalized now, so areas of brighter white represent higher slopes on average. And you can see sort of the distribution of the mean slope, both in our latitude and longitudinal directions around the edges of each of these maps. And then, so the slope is going to influence where they can successfully hunt prey. Road and housing density are going to influence where wolves are going to want to be, and also potentially conflict as well. But we're including it on this suitability side of the model for now. We'll talk about conflict a lot more going forward. And finally, for winter, we used remotely sensed estimates of snow cover, because where there's going to be less consistent snow cover throughout the winter, these are going to be areas where within those regions where prey are found, they're going to want to congregate even more to seek out that forage available to them. So we can incorporate these. That's for winter. So summer, it's the same things, slope and road and housing density, but now instead of obviously including snow cover, we're looking at forage. So mean NDVI, which is essentially greenness. So where those species are going to find that green forage. And again, this is much broader across the state now. And so here we end up with probability of wolf space use for both. On the top here shows summer, the bottom shows winter. Now this excludes prey density. This is just literally what I just showed you, those three factors rolled into each seasonal map. So we take that, and for example, with summer, we now look at, here's where the prey are located based on those seasonal prey density maps that I showed you earlier. And when we multiply these out, we end up with just basically slightly more refined versions of that prey density map. So we know where the prey want to be in general, defined by those borders from CPW, but we can add additional information so that if we wanted to, we could really zoom in on different parts of the map and understand a much finer scale look at where prey might be, and wolves would therefore follow. The same thing for winter, and that's what it looks like for winter. And here's a much more zoomed in version with some cities put in place. So what you're seeing here is now our ecological suitability. So this incorporates how many prey, where are those prey by season, and then also factors that will influence where the prey might be at a much finer scale as well. But really, it's being driven by where are their prey at this point. So that's one side of the model. So that's habitat suitability. Now we're going to move into the conflict risk side of things. And this would be maybe a spot to pause if anyone has questions about that first side. We'll eventually talk about how we bring the habitat suitability together with conflict. But for now, that's just establishing one side of things. And if anyone has a quick question now, would be fine to yell it out or in the chat, I guess. I don't know. Let's see. Chat. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question about the. So I read some paper about the road has the they can block the genetic block the genetic diversity. Just sorry, between the two sides of the road. So have you considered this into the habitat suitability?
Yeah, so yeah, you're absolutely right for certain species. And when roadways become, if there's a high enough traffic volume, or it really depends on a species mobility. How is it able to, how far and easily is it able to move? And sort of also how resistant is it to move across a roadway? Some species simply just aren't going to care about roads, and the issue becomes, can they move across when there's not a car coming that's going to hit them? Where others, they're going to really, really want to avoid even crossing roads in general. For wolves, they actually lower use roads. So roads that don't see a lot of traffic, they actually like them. They use them as conduits for movement because it's easier to move, quicker to move, less resistance for moving. They move along them and can hunt easier that way. However, so big highways such as Interstate 70, which I believe I showed in the map back here, as it's going to help us define the western slope north and the western slope south. That is a potential major barrier for connecting populations. So this model that I'm showing today doesn't consider as much the actual potential connectivity. It considers seasonal connectivity of quality habitat that maximizes habitat suitability while minimizing conflict. Now, roads are baked in, as I mentioned slightly here, that they're baked into this road and housing density. And what we did is we only incorporated high volume roads, so highways and major roads. And this subtracts from this probability of wolf space use that I kind of glazed over. So we are considering it, but we aren't acting as if it's a hard and fast barrier to completely prevent wolves from potentially crossing it. At this point, we're just simply saying that more roads, more high traffic roads is a negative for wolves to want to establish a pack in that area. But you're absolutely right. And that's something that is maybe a next step as we kind of dive into a certain area that we think is really high habitat suitability and low conflict risk. Then we can start thinking about, the different roadways and how it might influence genetic, transfer of genetics from pack to pack, or however. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Hey, Mark, I'm not sure if you can see. Oops, sorry. I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but there was one more question from Kitty, and she asks, to come up with your ultimate suitability map, did you weight any of the factors like prey availability, et cetera, over others? If so, how did you decide on the weighting scheme?
Right. So we'll talk towards the end where we're weighting different components of the conflict risk differently to come up with different sensitivity analyses, because we're really not sure what's the most important thing for driving conflict. We can make guesses, but we want to understand the sensitivity. And for prey availability, some of the sensitivity analyses we did was just considering elk and deer, and then others where we considered all the species. And then some of the other sensitivity analyses we did with just the elk and deer was we looked back at their populations over the last 10 years. And in one scenario, we took the minimum population for each and every one of those analysis units that I showed you in the beginning and applied that. So like sort of a worst case scenario. So if going forward, if climate made these populations really tank, what would we potentially expect to see as a low population, and what would that mean for the distribution of wolf habitat suitability? And then we also took one where, what if these populations really took off for various other ecological reasons, and we took the maximum population that we've seen in the last 10 years. In terms of weighting, we're not really weighting anything here. All of these, these three components that get rolled into this probability of wolf space use, they're currently all just equal weighting. One is, subtracting the negatives, adding, the NDVI, but we weight the different conflict things. So what you're seeing here is actually still, so here in this middle map, this is still density of animals. And then they're getting multiplied out by this probability of space use. So if you are at the maximum here and you're in really good habitat, you're still maintaining that highest density and probability of use in this final third series of maps here. Whereas if you have a ton of density, but you're in a spot where we're assuming the probability of wolf space use is near zero, it's going to reduce that actual availability, that density, or this, it's no longer really density in this final summer habitat suitability number, because we're multiplying these first components. So there's no actual weighting going on in this first aspect. It's just we're establishing this as a baseline, and then in our sensitivity analyses, thinking about, well, what if these prey populations shift in numbers? And we'll talk about weighting the conflict side of things now. So yeah, on this conflict risk side of things, sorry, one second. Some of these, there we go. The video chat was in the way. The conflict risk side of things, we can think about a few different things. So we have livestock risk. So wolves are going to be drawn into easy to kill prey, which would be sheep and cattle and all those things. We can think about mortality to wolves just because in terms of their protection. So considering where are their areas of private lands, where are they going to be protected in national parks? And then there's sort of these in-between areas, such as a wilderness area. They're not going to necessarily, be in someone's backyard, and someone might, mistake it for a coyote or whatever, or come into direct conflict with people. But they could, if people wanted to, could poach them in those sorts of areas. So there's different weightings we can think about that. But really, what makes this whole situation completely unique is that we have basically a population level census of how people feel about wolves because of the vote data. And so as I talked about, that paper that I sent out, it's talking about this anthropogenic resistance and how people use the landscape and all this. And a lot of times social scientists will send out surveys, and several hundred people make for a large sample size normally. And then most of the effort is then modeling how those people responded and modeling it out across the landscape. And then you end up with a lot of variability, because it's really hard to understand people's values, how they feel about things, and to really extrapolate those really well. I mean, certainly people do good jobs with it, but it's not perfect. So what's super unique here is that we can actually incorporate how people voted on this very issue. Do you want wolves restored or not? and incorporate that in our conflict risk side of things. So for public lands, what we have here is we were able to look at Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management grazing allotments. And they were kind enough to send us actual recent stocking densities of how many individuals were on all of these different allotments. And it's shocking how extensive they are throughout the state. But when you dive in, some of them are a lot more heavily stocked than others. And when we convert these to a smoothed raster at that same wolf pack level smoothing that I talked about earlier, this is what it sort of looks like for what we're calling this is summer public livestock density, because these are public lands, and we weighted this 2 times the private land values, which I'll show you in a minute. And the reason we did that is because we assume livestock on public lands where they're sort of left out in these open pens, or these open allotments, are much more vulnerable to wolf predation than a sheep that's a few hundred meters from a farmhouse on private lands. And so this is summer, and we just took all of the data and applied it. This is what was available as a snapshot in 2019. Now, the issue is, what about winter? And what we found out through talking with agricultural experts is that there are still livestock on public lands in the winter. It's just obviously these high country ones aren't available because they're filled with snow. So we did a bunch of looking at some of the data, and with talking to people, what we found is that generally the livestock allotments, and this is the same livestock allotments, except these are the ones that are below 2,000 meters in elevation. And we looked at our snow data, and they receive hardly, very little snow compared to the other ones. And so we had to make the simplifying assumption that in the winter, the public land livestock grazing looks very different, in that it looks something like this. These are just the livestock areas that are below 2,000 meters. So this is public lands. Now, what about private lands? Now, this becomes really difficult in that there's just really not great data out there on how many livestock at a very fine scale. You can get at county level livestock numbers, but it's not really what we need for kind of assessing at sort of a wolf pack range level analysis. And so what I did was I looked into data from what's called Cropscape, and it has the production of different agricultural crops. And I looked for the crops that are associated with raising livestock, so alfalfa and hay. And we were able to, so that Cropscape data is actually 30-meter pixels. And I was able to sum up the area devoted to those crop types by county and compare it to the county level cattle and sheep production. And that's what you see on the y-axis. And on our x-axis is that production of agriculture. And there's a strong relationship on the western slope, an R-squared close to 0.8. And so what it shows us is that while it's not a perfect spatial estimate of where there are livestock on private lands, it shows us where there is feed being grown for them, and there's likely livestock in those general areas within a county. And so this is what it looks like, that proxy, this is private land values. This is the sort of the percentage of the hay and alfalfa plotted across the whole state. So where you have these high clusters of hay and alfalfa, we're assuming this is where there's more livestock being kept on private lands, both in the summer and the winter. It's a huge simplifying assumption, but we've talked to many experts, and this is the best, coming up with an approach like this seemed like the best approach for approximating where there are livestock on private lands. Now, I mentioned ownership, and here we have ownership of just land ownership, and we have National Park Service lands, which we're assuming are the most well protected, and then we have wilderness lands, slightly less protection, and that there's not park rangers everywhere preventing poaching or things like that. Some protections such as state parks or Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service lands, and then there's local administration, which is only a few of those, and then private lands, which offer no protection in terms of just monitoring of wolves. Now here's really the unique piece. This is wolf restoration voting data, the proportion of yes votes by precinct. This isn't actually available yet, but I was able to sort of scrape it off of the Secretary of State's website and apply it to our precinct values, so that we get our finest scale possible of. And what you see here is the blue represents the proportion of the public that voted yes for restoration and on this ballot initiative. And so there's and I should mention before we go forward with it, there's a lot of reasons why you might not vote for wolf restoration, and they're actually looking. Social scientists in the Center for Human Carnivore Existence are looking into this by asking people, if you didn't vote for wolf restoration, why not? And what the interesting piece about this is that when they sent out the surveys before the vote, they asked people, are you going to vote for this or not? And they got a response of about 70-some% said they were planning to vote for wolf restoration. But when they got in the ballot box, as you saw, it was basically a 50-50 split. And so the idea here is that, there's other factors that go in. Maybe people lied to the survey, but there's also other motivations of maybe they thought it was too costly, or they thought wolves should just come back naturally. But as I'll show you, it was going to be a pretty difficult route for them to traverse, given the way that they were typically returning to the state. So yeah, and sorry, if I'm running short on time, you should just yell at me. I'll try to wrap things up here relatively quickly. So
we have about 12, 13 minutes officially in the class, but we can stay longer if you have more to say.
Yeah, I can easily wrap things up with whatever I have left. So for our conflict side of things, we are thinking about seasonal values. But unlike summer and winter for prey availability and ecological suitability, there's not as much difference seasonally, because what's being rolled into this map, so this is now our estimate of conflict risk in the winter, scaled. So these values are only relative, so a darker purple means more conflict risk, while these orange values mean less potential conflict. And so what this does is, for winter, it rolls together winter public grazing of livestock, private grazing of livestock, ownership of land, so that stays the same no matter what season, and then of course this voting data, which stays the same with whatever season. And in this initial model that I'm showing you these results for, we weighted livestock as having 50% of the weight of this risk side of things, whereas voting got 25%, and then our land ownership got 25% as well. And so then in our sensitivity analyses, we tried weighting these in different ways to see sort of how this influenced where within these different regions we were seeing high conflict, et cetera. So that's what winter looks like. Summer actually looks really similar. It's just now we have those high elevation livestock grazing areas to think about. So we have our ecological side of things, and now we have our conflict side of things, and we want to be able to combine them in some way. They're not really on the same scale. The data are completely different beasts at this point. So how do we bring them together to understand overall suitability? And so we can kind of think about the convergence and divergence of high risk, high suitability, and I'll show you what I mean in these bivariate choropleth plots that I developed for this. And I'm going to take a quick drink of water. So here is our winter mapping, and what I'll point your attention to this matrix of colors down here, because it's going to relate to things over here, and this will hopefully become much more clear. So in these 4 bottom green areas, these are what we're considering high habitat suitability and minimum conflict risk. So areas in green on the map we generally are maximizing that ecological side of things. So it's relatively the highest values in the state while having the relatively lowest values for conflict risk. And so how this works is basically we have our two distributions of the maps that I showed you, those final maps of ecological suitability, conflict risk. This code that I've made divvies up the values into different quantile groupings. So it's relative low to high for each of those, and then looks at their overlapping values. So as I just mentioned, green is where you have the highest ecological value and the lowest conflict risk potential. Whereas up here in pink, this is where we have our highest values for conflict, but our lowest values for habitat suitability. So these would be areas that, yeah, it would result in high conflict, except that the matter is that wolves likely don't even want to be there because there's nothing really there habitat-wise for them to seek out. What we really want to understand is for management, we want to understand these sort of purplish areas, because what this represents now is areas where we have both. We have high values for habitat suitability, so wolves want to be there, but also when they get drawn into these areas, whether it's natural prey or whatever, they might also then come across these things that would bring them into high conflict risk, such as livestock being there as well. And what's easier to kill than a bull elk? Well, a bunch of sheep, or come across areas where there's people that don't really want them there, and so on and so forth. And then finally, this area we're not concerned about at all because this is low habitat suitability, ecological suitability, and low risk for conflict. Hopefully that generally makes sense. So yeah, and then this is what it looks like for summer. Again, we have a lot more of the green relative to that tan, and that tan is simply in the winter because those are the high elevation areas where there's not prey, so wolves don't want to be there anyway. But what we see, and then it's also the same no matter how we looked at our different sensitivity analyses that I was talking about, is no matter what we did, generally, while there's really good habitat in the northwest corner of the state, it's where we run into a ton of conflict potential because of the livestock, because of people's attitudes towards wolves, and a lot more private lands, things like that. Whereas the southwest western slope, we have a lot more, we have pretty good prey base and a lot less livestock and more general acceptance for wolves in that area. Obviously, the Front Range is sort of a mixed bag. You have some good habitat, but you also have more conflict potential and pockets of a lot more humans. And in the Eastern Plains, there's conflict potential and also not as much quality habitat as well. So yeah, and then this sort of tells a whole story, but for managers and others to kind of break this out to understand and to more quantify areas of high suitability and high conflict potential and how it changes based on our different sensitivity analyses, I basically extracted two different things. The two things that we're really interested in, and it's these two, the upper right set of four values, those four colors. So that's those high conflict potential, high ecological suitability. That's what we're calling conflict hotspots. And then that lower right, that's our overall habitat suitability, because we're minimizing, at least relatively within the state, relatively minimizing conflict risk while maximizing habitat suitability. And this is what it looks like when we think about summer. The top area, so out of these, the absolute highest values of conflict risk, so that conflict hotspots, where we have high values of ecological suitability, but also high values of potential conflict risk. And what I did here is the orange represents where we had values of this for the summer map. The blue is where we had winter estimates, and then that brighter pink orange color, reddish pink, is where the two overlap for summer and winter. And it's, you know, really this consistent high area of conflict hotspots in the northwestern corner. And that's where wolves have been coming from Wyoming and not doing so well getting to the other potentially safer areas that also have good amounts of habitat quality throughout the state. That's for that conflict side of things. Now, habitat suitability. So this is where we're maximizing the ecological side while generally minimizing the conflict side. And again, summer in that more yellowy orange, winter in blue, and then that pink hotter color is where they overlap for both seasons. So we can then, this sort of beginning to form the foundation of thinking about seasonal connectivity as well. But again, this is just sort of an initial broad scale map thinking about relative habitat suitability for wolves within the state so that managers can start honing in on areas that might be suitable for restoration. And so we can think about extracting these and overlaying them on other different things that CPW is interested in. And for example, here's wolf, here's where those gray values are where we, you know, estimated to have good habitat suitability for winter for wolves. And what you're seeing underneath it is the targeted elk population by CPW. So this is that sort of issue with that southwest corner where it's a trade-off where we have less conflict, but we also have elk herds that are below where CPW wants them to be. So they're not reproducing and they're not as high as where they want them. So if people are concerned about wolves impacting populations of, you know, hunting species such as elk and deer that are, you know, obviously economically and socially important for the state, we also have to think about these management needs as well. So we can overlay where we think wolves will do best, but consider these other outside factors for CPW. Here's the same thing for summer. And we can do it again for deer populations as well, where, you know, and again, these targets shift for CPW. So these aren't hard and fast, but just to give you an idea of how this can be applied when we delineate habitat suitability, what other things can we think about for planning restoration? And again, I talked about these sensitivity analyses, but we can compare our values of, we thought wolves would hone in on primarily on elk and deer based on their behavior in other parts of the Northern Rockies. But if they do also seek out moose and pronghorn and these other things, what does that look like? How does that shift our conflict hotspots and our overall suitability? Thinking about livestock vulnerability, I have also done a version where I weighted sheep as 6 times more vulnerable than cattle because they're easier for wolves to kill. How does that shift that conflict hotspot? And altered weighting for the different conflict layers, as I talked about, and then also other issues for CPW and considering their management of these prey species to also make sure, you know, the human population is accepting of wolves by not totally decimating things people want to hunt as well. And so that's the end of my presentation for today. If we have time for any questions, I'm happy to. Otherwise, I can also respond to email if we're out of time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. That was really fascinating. And I took a ton of notes that we're going to talk about in class next week. We did have one question come in the chat. What components have the biggest overlap between habitat suitability and conflict risk during the PCA?
So what's the PCA?
The principal components analysis?
Oh, doing a principal component analysis. Yeah. You know, that's the thing is that we actually can make those maps based on how different groups want to see them. So for example, we're working with agricultural, you know, managers throughout the state for livestock, and they really only want to, they only care about livestock. Well, we can compare how does the livestock risk, you know, how do our maps change if we're only incorporating livestock into that conflict risk side of things. But generally what I'd say is no matter how we alter these different scenarios, that it was pretty stable in terms of the percentage of areas of considered high conflict risk or high ecological suitability in how we broke down the state. And I kind of showed you, but didn't really explicitly talk about it, but we broke it down in terms of everything north of I-70 as being the northern western slope, everything south being the southern western slope. We have the Front Range and the Eastern Plains. And generally, that southwestern area, no matter how we altered sensitivity to different livestock, to everything else, had a really high ratio of really high suitability to low conflict, whereas that northwest corner had a really pretty stable high conflict. Now it increased by quite a bit when we weighted things more for conflict for livestock. So it's really being driven by livestock in that northwest corner to kind of to answer your question more directly. But yeah, there's, because it's all theoretical and relative, there's so many different ways to slice this. We had to go with what's our best guess based on the literature to represent how we think things will play out. But then we altered things individually to kind of understand, well, how drastically is this going to shift everything if we're wrong with this one component and it's actually more this component, those sorts of scenarios to just make sure that we're not completely wrong if our assumptions are slightly off or largely off even.
Thanks. I'm going to squeeze in a quick announcement for my class. There is another question though. So for class actually in 2 weeks, March 8th, for all of you guys, March 8th, our next guest speaker is how GIS was used on the Cameron Peak fire. So that's a good one to tune into. And then for the people in my class, the web map assignment was due today. Next week in class, we're going to talk about Model Builder. And I think I'm going to use some of the examples from today and try to talk about how it can be done in Model Builder. And I'd like to discuss a little bit more about how the GIS behind this stuff. So for those of you in class, that's what's happening next week. We did have another question from Mary Jean. Historically, where were wolves found in Colorado?
Oh man, essentially everywhere is my understanding. And actually, I don't even have, I just went into it with the understanding they were essentially everywhere on the plains and in the mountains. Actually, probably more abundant, actually, out on the plains where there was really high populations of prey long ago before agricultural conversion. But yeah, based on my knowledge of other states and wolves' historical distributions, I would say they were probably literally throughout the entire state. But you could probably look that up. I could be completely wrong for Colorado. But other efforts have looked at this like 15 years ago. And they considered more like pack dynamics and things like that. And again, they ended up sort of coming to the same sort of conclusion of that sort of the safest bet is more the southwestern corner of things. But we took a different approach with updated data and more, new approaches for the conflict side of things.
Thanks. Andrea, you have your hand up for a question?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ditmer. This has been really, really interesting. But one of the things I was interested in, because you had mentioned using hay and alfalfa as a proxy for private land and winter, is that right? For
summer and winter, yeah. But yeah.
Okay. Well, because one of the interesting things that we've seen here working with some local landowners, and it's been reflected across the Rocky Mountain West, is that some deer and elk, some portions of the populations are no longer migrating into the summer range. And so is that something you guys have considered for, because that would obviously alter habitat suitability as well as the conflict element of some of your modeling. And if some of those elements have gone into your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about that. We aren't at this stage doing a forward-looking forecasting thing with potential changes in climate and those and agricultural changes and even growth within the state. We might do that because there are great modeling things out there already with forecasting growth and those sorts of things. This is essentially a snapshot for the most recent snapshot in time, because and I think this relates to someone else's question I saw pop up, is that the state is now required to return them to the landscape within the next 2 years, I think. So the wolves will come back. It's just a matter of how many, where, and how quickly. But in terms of more to your question, though that is somewhat incorporated here in that CPW, where they know about herds that generally are resident populations and no longer migrate, we incorporated that. That got the same density value in the summer and the winter, wherever that the population density overlaid on top of that resident delineation, that value just stayed static from the summer and the winter. And then we shifted obviously the summer and winter ranges and different concentrations, which we had to come up with assumptions for what we thought a concentration meant exactly for the population. But yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's going to be interesting as things play out with changes in climate, the dynamics of migration. We might see a lot less of it. Certainly some areas will probably continue for a long period, but yeah, you're going to see probably more and more of that. And also just, like in Minnesota where I did my PhD, there's major changes in the types of crops that people are growing with different climate too. So it allowed for more corn to be grown, and bears expanded out to take advantage of tasty crops that previously had been like soybeans and things like that they weren't interested in. So yeah, it's a fascinating thing for future work for sure.
Well, it's especially interesting in the absence of the empirical data that you had talked about, because really that in so many instances, we don't have that high quality movement data. And so how do we get around that to still understand the landscape? And I greatly appreciate what you guys have done with this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Obviously, if anyone has to go, you can go, but there are two more questions. First, are you an optimist or pessimist on the future of the introduction of wolves into Colorado based on your study?
Yeah, well, the state is now required to bring them back, barring any sort of crazy legal shenanigans that could potentially happen. But I think it's essentially set in stone from my naive understanding of how the amendment works. So they will be coming back. And I think that there's a great prey base for wolves in the state. It's actually much higher in Colorado than in other places where they've returned. So it's not like the wolves are going to be starving wherever we put them. It's a matter of managing and reducing conflict and having human acceptance and putting programs into place. And that's really what a lot of this is going to do, is allow managers and outreach folks to get ahead of the curve, get ahead of conflict, so that they know where to put their resources, where to do education about how to reduce conflict with wolves and things like that. I don't know if we are loosely working with CPW. I've presented it for them and they are very interested in it. I don't know what capacity they'll adopt our maps and things like that. But they certainly are aware of them, and we're finishing up the publication on this now. So hopefully they'll, when it's fully published, it will be as at least educational and guidance for moving forward to some degree. But I'm an optimist for it.
That's good. That's good. That's promising. All right, and we'll call this one the last question from Elizabeth. Do you expect in the future to be able to conduct model testing or validation based on GPS data from some newly collared wolves in Colorado?
I would guarantee any ones that get released will have a collar on them to be able to track them at super fine scales. That's super exciting. I would love to be able to work on that data. My postdoc will probably be done by then, but it could easily prove what my model's wrong. But I think that, I think that'll be, obviously that's needed for future management. They'll probably pick an area and, do some release with high monitoring for a few years. And based on that information, potentially pick other spots for restoration or changes in management. And it's got to be an adaptive process to stay ahead of the curve and to make sure that they can, survive in perpetuity throughout the state.
All right, great. Well, again, thank you, Mark, Dr. Ditmer, be formal. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. If you look in the chat, everyone seemed to enjoy it very much. We really appreciate your time, and thanks to all of the attendees. I know the NR493 folks had to be here, but everyone else chose to be here. So that's great. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, and email me if you have any questions. I don't know, or email. Yeah, I can get you Mark's email if you email me. How about that? Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.